Also, it's Hong Kong is a real northern.
I think there's still a few stragglers that may be coming in, but Jonathan Mantorp has to leave at 3 o'clock. And so I want to make sure that that Earl has a chance to say everything that he wants to say before Jonathan leaves. I'm Jan Walls at the David Lamb Center. Welcome to our David Lamb Center Pacific Region Forum. Our speaker today needs no introduction, so of course I will introduce him now. Earl Drake, of course, has had a whole career in international relations, more specifically the diplomatic side of international relations, much of that involving China, from the contextual concerns of his concerns as Assistant Deputy Minister for East Asia, Northeast Asia, for Asia Pacific, the whole Asia Pacific, to Ambassador to China, and subsequent to that, as he has been with us here at the Lamb Center as Director of the Canadian Liaison Office of the China Council for International Cooperation on the Environment and Development, and he's also been Vice President of the Canada-China Trade Council, Business Council. Yes, Canada-China used to be Trade Council. Canada-China Business Council. He is not only concerned with things in China, and the program which he coordinates, which he directs here, is one that links international research to almost directly to the central cabinet in Beijing. So he has a chance to observe and to communicate with leaders in China. And Earl being Earl, he never overlooks a chance like that. And so recently he's been back, and he has very kindly agreed to present us a forum today on, we're not sure yet, it's either new leaders and huge challenges, or huge leaders and new challenges. But we'll know when we'll know after he's gotten into his presentation. And Earl knows that our modus operandi here is to make the presentation within the hour, which will leave us adequate time for dialogue with the attendees, which is why we call it a forum. And without further ado, Earl, please.
Thank you. First, I want to be sure I'm heard at the back. Is this microphone working? Good, good. Well, my central topic today is the challenges facing the new Communist Party leaders who were just selected by the Party Congress, which met in November. I just happened to be there just at that period. In order to place this topic in perspective, I would like to go, first I'd like to go back briefly and look at the early record of the Communist Party regime in China, so we can see how it's evolved, how it's changed over that period, and then look at the contemporary situation, and then try to look ahead at what we might expect in the future. So let me just try and put this up on this, up on the screen. There we are. There we are. I put that up there so you can get an outline. No, I'm sorry. That's a little bit. No, that. There we are. That's the general outline. I put it up there so you can see the general outline, and also to reassure you, because if in the course of the next hour you think I'm drifting, don't worry, there is a roadmap to which I'll eventually return. I'd like to just begin by looking back a little bit at China's erratic record, because I find that people often say to me, what should we make of China? It often sends puzzling signals, and it's been doing that for years, puzzling signals to the outside world. Now, Canadian leaders, and particularly under Prime Minister Chrétien, have been pretty consistent. They've said China is a good economic partner for Canada and a responsible member of the United Nations and APEC. Yes, we criticize some aspects of human rights, but by and large, we find China a good partner. And the Prime Minister has taken 2 large Team Canada delegations to China, businessmen, government leaders. I was associated with both of those, and I can say that overwhelming response from Canadians and reciprocal response from the Chinese, very warm response. So Canada-China relations seem to be fine. But the American-Chinese relations are different. They are volatile. They go up and down, and there's a great variety of view in the United States about how to deal with China. Some Americans, currently, relations are pretty good because they have a common interest in dealing with terrorism, particularly Muslim terrorism. But many Americans still say, some in the administration, some in the media, and some in Hollywood, say that because of spying, arms proliferation, human rights violations, and unfair trade practices, United States policy should not be one of cooperation with China, but of containing China. Keep China in check. Use every available means. This is okay. I guess I should not move around, but the whole idea of a mobile mic is to be able to move around. So a number of Americans are saying, debating whether they should cooperate with China or contain China. And containment means using various methods, political, diplomatic, and even military. And one very active American proposal is to build a missile defense shield based on South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Now, officially, it's not aimed at anybody, but if you look at a map, it's certainly not aimed at Outer Mongolia. So it's pretty clear who is the target, and the Chinese understand that very well. Still not working. So whom should we believe? I mean, what's the real record on China? I believe that much of the confusion stems from its erratic record in the first 30 to 40 years of communist rule. Not in recent times, but a lot of the memories and problems in interpreting China go back to the early days. In 1949, after the communists won the Civil War and took power, I think most foreigners were apprehensive, but were nevertheless prepared to give the new regime the benefit of the doubt. They seemed to have high ideals, and their objectives were to help the poor, to give a bigger place for women, a lot of high ideals, and so most people were prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. But early on, 2 things happened which alarmed the Western world. It sent the wrong signals. In 1950, North Korea, it sounds very, very familiar, North Korea invaded the South. The United Nations took collective action. The UN came in to defend South Korea. It wasn't just the US unilateral action. The US, Canada, Turkey, many countries came to defend South Korea. And then in the course of that war, when the UN forces got close to the Chinese border, China intervened, the PLA intervened against the United Nations. Well, that sends a very negative and hostile signal to the outside world. Similarly, the PLA began to introduce military occupation of Tibet. Now, I won't go into the whole complicated history of Tibet-China relations, but it was true that in the Qing dynasty that China did station imperial commissioners, ambans, they called them, in Lhasa, and they did have a small garrison there. But there was never anything approaching a military occupation. Beginning in 1950, after that, China imposed military occupation. That also sent very negative signals. Moreover, increasingly it became clear that there were revolutionary movements in many of the countries of Southeast Asia. communist movements directly aided and abetted by China that were trying to use terrorist methods to try and overthrow the government. I happened to be stationed in Malaysia, Malaya was then, before it became Malaysia. And we talked about the CTs all the time, the communist Chinese terrorists. So a negative signal was sent to the outside world in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Indochina. And China became this new regime for which there had been high hopes in the outside world, sent negative signals. In China itself, of course, the new regime did many good things. It did wonderful things in terms of rural development, helping the rural poor. But it also, word began to seep out that it inflicted terrible suffering on many people in the Great Leap Forward and in the Cultural Revolution. And so, for its first 30 years, I think we can say as a generalization, New China was seen as a destabilizing force in other Asian countries and an isolated, economically depressed, and politically repressive regime at home. No wonder it was viewed with suspicion abroad. But this began to change in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping, after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came to power and announced new policies of opening to the outside world and the increased use of market forces. China's economy and the people's standard of living began to rise. And Canada became increasingly interested in active collaboration with China. In 1986, I accompanied Prime Minister Mulroney on a formal state visit to China. And we found China to be vibrant and Canada enthusiastic about getting to know each other well. And I remember particularly Prime Minister's call on Deng Xiaoping, that wonderful leader of China, that stocky, vibrant, totally engaged man sitting there receiving our Prime Minister. And of course, as a courteous host, he invited our Prime Minister to lead the discussion. And you remember, some of you will remember that at least that Mulroney had this deep baritone voice, and he had a kind of florid way of speaking. He saw the occasion and he began and he said, "Now, Mr. Chairman, I've been reflecting on our two countries. And my first observation is that we have the opposite problem. Canada has too much land and not enough people, and China has the reverse. You have too many people and not enough land." And he expected to use that as a platform to develop these themes. But Deng Xiaoping was too impatient. I mean, he couldn't wait for this man to go on at that pace. And he was too lively, and he interrupted and he said, "Prime Minister, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. You don't need to expand on this point. But the point is, what do we do about it?" That was typical of Deng Xiaoping. Don't theorize. He was a pragmatist. What do we do about it? And he said, "I have a solution for you to solve both our problems. I'll give you as many people as you'd like. How many would you like? 20 million, 50 million, 100 million? You decide." Well, Mr. Mulroney backed off. But then Deng said, "But that doesn't work for you. I have another solution. What I intend to do is to make the Chinese economy hum. I'm going to make this a vibrant economy. And it'll be good for the whole world. It will help trading and relations. It'll be good for Canada, good for China. And I intend to do that in two ways. First of all, we found that the increased use of market forces has increased productivity in agriculture greatly in China. We're going to move that, extend it from agriculture to industry, so to make industry hum. And we're going to do more and more to open to the outside world. And we have a model. This is not just theoretical. He was always pragmatic. We have a model. We're not going to model ourselves on Canada or the United States. Your history is too different. Your culture is too different. We have a specific model. We have a country in mind that also has a feudal past like ours, has a history of Confucian thinking, a country we know well, a country that used to be a tributary state to China. And that is South Korea, not North Korea. Those guys are going in the wrong direction. But South Korea, we've seen how they've increased productivity, how their standard of living is growing, and we're going to model ourselves on South Korea. If they can do it, we can do it. We know them well. And my plan is we will catch up to South Korea in terms of standard of living, per capita income, by the middle of the next century, by 2050. Well, Mr. Prime Minister Mulroney and I came away thinking, well, this is all pretty exaggerated. He has very lofty ambitions, but nevertheless, he's on the right track. I mean, this is someone we can deal with. This is an exciting economy. And so Canada announced increased trading relations, set up an aid program, opened a new consulate in Shanghai, and China would open a new one in Canada. So an active relationship. It was in that atmosphere of enthusiasm and potential for future cooperation that I was sent to China in 1987 as ambassador. And for the first year and a half, that was the atmosphere. Increased cooperation, enthusiastic outlook for the future. Then the Tiananmen Square tragedy struck in May, June 1989. You all remember that because it was covered so vividly back here. You remember the mass student demonstrations supported by the people of Beijing. It wasn't just a student body, it was a huge outpouring of support. And then the declaration of martial law and the hunger strike. And the first entry of troops into the Tiananmen Square in that area, unarmed troops stopped by the ordinary citizenry. It was like flower power, it's like it was happening in the Philippines. People thought this may be a peaceful solution. And then the shock to the people of China and the shock to the world when those hordes of tanks came in and just shot in all directions, not just demonstrators, but bystanders. Most foreigners left, a few of us stayed behind. We were regarded as essential, and I think that means expendable staff. We had to stay behind and see what would happen, but most foreigners left. And once again, I think the Western world was baffled by China's puzzling behavior. It seemed that China was on a new course, cooperation, openness. Now, all of a sudden, a country that proclaimed its interest in conforming to international behavior and getting to know being part of the international community, suddenly decided to use lethal force, brutality on its own use, needlessly. Of course, one can understand they had to clear the square, but the puzzle was, why didn't they use the same techniques as their South Korean role models do regularly? South Koreans are experts at using water cannon and batons, but they don't kill people, they just beat them up. But why had China decided to use lethal force? So again, I think people were puzzled. And in that fall of 1989, the Western world was alienated from China. They were temporarily frightened away. Investors, governments, international organizations said we're putting everything on hold. And we wondered whether China would ever bounce back, or whether China would retreat into isolation again. But gradually and quietly, without ever admitting any fault, China became less blatant about human rights abuses and more cooperative on international issues, while the Western world became more pragmatic and less idealistic in dealing with China, particularly about doing business there. Let me give you a concrete Canadian example of how pragmatism came into play. A couple of months after Tiananmen Square, when we had orders to have no official dealings with China, we never broke off diplomatic relations, but we said no high-level visits. The Chinese minister in charge of food purchases came to me and asked for an official visa because ever since 1970, China had been buying wheat from Canada. In 1970, when China was hungry, when no one else would sell them wheat, Canada did. And we have been consistent suppliers of wheat ever since, regardless of... Oh, sorry. You got it? No, it's all right. It's back. Yeah. Regardless of what was happening in the outside world, regardless of the Cold War, we always sold them wheat. came to me, I said, Minister, you realize that if you asked me for an official visa as a minister of China to go on an official visit, I have to say no. That's the rule in Canada and the other Western countries, no high-level official visit. But if you come to me as citizen Wong, who wants to pay a friendly visit to old friends in China and give me an ordinary passport and ask for a visitor's visa, I'm happy to do it, and your Canadian Wheat Board pals will be delighted to see you. And that's the way we did it, quietly and pragmatically. And so that's how China and the rest of the world began, without any official declarations, to get back to a pragmatic way of working together. Well, that's by way of background, but it's important to know that those confused signals over a period of 40 years have left a legacy of people being confused about China. Well, what's the situation in China today? China today, the economic performance is really impressive. China has moved steadily to a hybrid mixed command market system and integration with the world economy and integration with many international organizations. Recently it's joined the WTO, and I'll say more about that later. The Eastern Seaboard, all the major cities are bustling and prosperous with modern office buildings, well-stocked stores and restaurants, and construction cranes everywhere. During the recent economic turbulence in Asia, which affected most of Southeast Asia, China was a haven of economic growth and political stability. China's GNP has grown steadily all those years. And this year, the latest reports say it grew 8% with virtually no inflation. And few Westerners, I think, have noticed that China is now the world's #4 economy. If you compare the other big countries, big population countries of the Euro-Asian landmass, Russia, India, and Indonesia, where does China stand? The Chinese economy is bigger than all those three put together. How many of you knew that? Bigger than Russia, bigger than India, all put together. So China, its growth, its economic growth has just been amazing. And the vast majority of the Chinese population benefits from and supports the government economic program. Average income of the Chinese people has quadrupled since 1978 when Deng came to power. Poverty is significantly reduced. Consumer goods and food are plentiful, and inflation has become negligible. So is everything rosy? Has China picked the ideal leaders? Let's try this first. So has China picked the ideal leaders to ensure future prosperity? My answer is not necessarily. Probing beneath the shiny surface, we find 7 major challenges. The first is clearly growing unemployment. During the decade ahead, China needs to create 1 to 200 million new jobs for people leaving overstaffed sectors, particularly agriculture and the state-owned enterprises. 1 to 200 million new ones, plus another 80 million new jobs for new entrants to the labor force. Because even though China has a very vigorous population growth policy, they're still, with a huge base of 1.2 billion, there's bound to be some increase. So up to 280 million new jobs have to be created in the next decade. And we already have serious national unemployment. And there is little social safety net to catch those who fall by the wayside. In the past, there was a system. You depended on your work unit, your employer. They provided schooling, medicine, housing, pension, cradle-to-grave social security system. Now that doesn't apply, and the state does not yet have a comprehensive system. We know that there are a lot of reports about social unrest, isolated demonstrations. So far there is no national protest, but the way ahead is worrying to all Chinese leaders. The next and somewhat related point is about the inefficient state sector. It drastically needs reform, and the Chinese leaders recognize it. That sector is huge, is inefficient, and overstaffed. It absorbs approximately 2/3 of urban employment. In all the cities, it accounts for 2/3 of employment, but only results in 1/3 of the output. You can see how inefficient it is. So the Chinese authorities know that the state's enterprises need to be merged, sold, scaled down, or just simply closed. And one of the worst aspects of this are the banks, the so-called commercial banks. There are no real commercial banks in China. They are really just a vehicle for channeling funds from the government and the party to those who have the right connections. So China needs to set up a system of viable commercial banks. And that is very worrying because in the economic crisis that affected the rest of Eastern Asia, it was the banks that were the most critical factor. It was the bank failure in South Korea, bank failure in Indonesia, bank failure in Thailand that triggered the problem. So China has bad debts and undercapitalization. Oops. Corruption. I'm sorry to say corruption is a major problem. In all levels, government, party, the army, the police, and state enterprises. According to official audits, this is not propaganda, this is Chinese official figures. In the first half of 1999, the last time in which I had these figures, the central government revenues, 1/5 of all central government revenues, over 14.2 billion US dollars, were diverted, misappropriated, squandered, or simply pocketed. That's pretty scandalous. And it is becoming well known, corruption. It's not just a few people who follow China closely. The Chinese intelligentsia know. I happened to be at an academic seminar in Beijing in September '99, which reached the following conclusion in writing. If China does not eliminate corruption, then China will erupt into economic crisis, which will lead to social and economic instability. The army alone has been ordered to drop 20,000 enterprises, many of which are illegal. Not just are they into business, but they're into illegal business, including two of their favorite enterprises are brothels and smuggling. And in my view, associated with the spread of corruption is a growing lack of spiritual, ethical, or ideological sense of purpose in personal life, beyond the maxim to get rich is glorious. That is satisfying for some young people, but more and more people are finding that not satisfying. Of course, many Chinese remain highly ethical, but I still find a kind of moral and spiritual vacuum in China today. The fourth point is uneven distribution of wealth. Western China is lagging behind the eastern seaboard, which is just growing so rapidly, so dramatically. The per capita income in Shanghai and Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces is 10 times that of the inland regions, the poorest provinces in the interior. Now China is now trying to do something about it. They are pumping a lot of central government revenues into the eastern provinces and into the western provinces, but they have a long way to go. Fifth, and this is an area where I'm working all the time, as Jan said, is increasing air and water pollution and deterioration of the ecology. A survey was done 2 years ago by two prestigious international environmental organizations, which they surveyed the cities of the world, and of the 10 most polluted cities in the world, 9 were in China. And none of those were Beijing. Some of us think Beijing is polluted, but it's way down the list compared to others like Lanzhou. And it poses not only a problem for the economy, but a problem for public health. The leading cause of death in China today, according to Chinese figures, is respiratory diseases directly attributable to pollution. But China, we should have some sympathy for China. They have a terrible problem. They have a basic problem in that 22% of the world's population resides in China, but it contains only 7% of the world's arable land. That's a very difficult equation to deal with. And to make matters worse, you have that basic equation, but the limited supply of arable land and the limited supply of potable water, which is being polluted by effluents being dumped into the rivers and by fertilizers being dumped into the countryside, these two supplies, land and water, keep shrinking in the face of pollution, industrialization, urbanization, of course, soil conservation, while the population keeps growing despite birth control. Growing at a reduced rate, but still growing by about 8 to 10 million a year. Now we come to the question of poor record of democracy and human rights. I'm not quite as severe on this as some American critics are, but nevertheless I want to be balanced here. China is certainly not democratic by Western standards. But it's also important to note it's not nearly as repressive as it was under Mao. China is still an autocratic state where no political dissent is tolerated and no independent judicial system exists. But citizens can now debate most economic and social issues. It's no longer forbidden to debate a number of these issues. The leadership, and unfortunately, the leadership does not tolerate any organized opposition. Currently, they are concentrating on Falun Gong. Now this, you've probably all heard of Falun Gong. This is a sect that's dedicated to breathing and meditation exercises, and a mixture of some Buddhist and Taoist ideas. It all seems quite harmless to most of us. But its sin is, it's not the doctrine. Its sin is that its leader is based in the United States. He's originally Chinese, but he now lives in the United States. Nobody knows where he lives, or I guess his followers do, but most of us don't. He's sort of hidden somewhere in the United States. He and his group are able to embarrass the authorities with demonstrations in prominent places in China, almost at will. And so their sin, Falun Gong, is that they have this organizational capacity and look like a secret organization with a secret leader. I think a student of Chinese history can have some sympathy for the nervousness of the authorities. I mean, it has a vague resemblance to the White Lotus and the Boxers and others who tried to overthrow a dynasty of the day. But to most contemporary observers, it looks the current heavy-handed police action against Falun Gong make the government of China look insecure, repressive, and anti-democratic. It's another example of mixed signals. The truth is, I believe, that most Chinese are not very interested in Western democracy. They only want a government that is stable, delivers prosperity, and does not intrude on their ordinary lives. There's an old Chinese saying, as many of you know, the best of all worlds is when the sky is blue, the mountains are high, and the emperor is far away. It's the BC philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And the recent 16th Party Congress gave virtually all its attention to economic issues, not political reform. It did endorse a more active role for county and municipal party congresses, but it cautioned, quote, "We should never copy any political system of the West," unquote. Now, the last point, and the important point, is leadership. The government of the past 20 years, I think, has been the best that most Chinese have ever done. Despite his mishandling of the Tiananmen demonstrations, Deng Xiaoping was an outstanding leader in several respects. He replaced Mao's disastrous social economic experiments in the name of ideology and the cult of personality with pragmatism, economic progress, and the merit principle of choosing people. His death in 1997 went smoothly, didn't lead to any internal disturbances. He put in place young, able economic managers, including Zhu Rongji, the bold, brilliant, but brittle Zhu Rongji, who has performed an economic miracle in transforming a fragile command economy into a fast-growing semi-market economy. In the view of many experts, without the firm hand of Zhu Rongji, China's economy might be in the same mess as that of Argentina today. Thus, China faces formidable political, social, and institutional challenges. However, the current generation has come to expect remarkable economic progress in the face of daunting problems. They forget that for the past 20 years, China has been fortunate to have two outstanding leaders, brilliant, bold, outstanding leaders, and that won't necessarily happen always in the future. The key question then for the future is, can China's new and untested leaders solve the current economic and institutional problems fast enough to sustain the economic reform momentum that promises prosperity for the next generation? That's the real test. Yeah. So what happened at the Party Congress? There are many minor decisions which I won't go into. I just want to stress two main ones. There were several economic and educational reforms, but the main one is, first of all, it was a peaceful transition of power, almost unprecedented in Chinese history, passed from one generation to the next. There were some internal struggles, but there were no bloodshed, no demonstrations in the streets. That went very peacefully. The other is that China has concentrated entirely on economic targets, not political reform, nothing like that. Keep the people happy, keep the economy going, and their aim is defined, their principal aim is to take the Chinese GDP, double it the first decade, and double it again the next decade, ending up with an economy quadruple the size of that today by 2020. Now, I would like to, in examining these two major consequences, the new leadership team and the growth target, I would like to turn first to the transition of the new team. The first is several prominent leaders stepped down. Li Peng stepped down. Li Peng had held many positions. He'd been premier, he'd been chairman of the National People's Congress. He's the last of the leaders of that generation who took part in the decision to use violence at Tiananmen Square. His departure means that it's possible, conceivable, I'm not saying it will happen, that there could be a reckoning of what happened in Tiananmen. Something like the Truth Commission set up in South Africa to determine what really happened to us today. That could happen with Li Peng stepping down. And I think he's probably the least popular man in China. His departure, I think, will really be no loss. Li Weihuan, I'm sorry to see him leave. He was the youngest and most politically progressive of that third generation. He was not due for mandatory retirement. He wasn't yet 70. My view is that he was probably knifed in the back by Jiang Zemin because of the fear that he would become the next chairman of the National People's Congress. And the National People's Congress is a bit toothless, but nevertheless, it is China's parliament. It's growing in authority, growing in prominence, and if you had a progressive like Li Weihuan at the head of it, I think he would have tried to use that, make that a major element in the whole new Chinese system. And I think he was knifed for that reason. So I'm sorry to see him go. It's not critical, but it's a shame he wasn't given a chance to make the NPC work. And of course, for me, the big loss is Zhu Rongji, one of the ablest and most courageous premiers in China's history, and probably the best economic manager in the world today. His departure will be a great loss to China, but many party bosses and government officials will be glad to see him go because he was incorruptible, and he has bruised many colleagues because of his intolerance of ineffectiveness, sloth, and greed. A stern taskmaster is never popular. Well, the new leaders, the Party Congress chose 187 people to join the Central Committee of the party, of whom only 4 were women. So much for women holding up half the sky, pretty small corner of the sky. Of that 187, 9 were selected for the all-powerful Standing Committee of the Politburo. I won't mention all 9 of them, but I do want to concentrate on the 4 key members of the leadership team. This work. The first is Jiang Zemin, but just before we go to Jiang Zemin, the man on the right, of course, is my hero, Zhu Rongji. And there he is conferring with Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin is the retiring party secretary and state president, very powerful man. He was supposed to step down at age 70 like everybody else. He created that rule to get rid of his rivals, and then somehow found a way around it. He intends to retain the military commission, which he thinks will be a way in which he can keep power. I'm not sure that he's right. It was a power base for Deng Xiaoping. He retained the military commission. But the history is completely different. Deng Xiaoping knew all the generals. He served with them, he campaigned with them, fought with them for years, and they all knew and trusted him. This man has never had a uniform on in his life. He has no military record. So I think he may be deluding himself, but nevertheless, he's holding on to the military commission. He also installed 6 of his allies in the powerful nine-man standing committee, including Zhang Qinghong. He is many people say, his ears, eyes, brain. He's the eminence grise, the brilliant man behind Jiang Zemin, younger and may be a future leader of China. He's now in the Politburo. The big question, I think, many people will be reassured that Jiang Zemin is there because his policies have been popular. I'm sure that the other young leaders, Hu Jintao, etc., do not welcome the old patriarch looking over their shoulder. So there will be a contest. We'll see when he fully retires. Will he stay on for another 5 years? Will he just stay on for a couple of years? That will be a big question mark. What happens to Jiang Zemin? The next and key person is Hu Jintao, the new party secretary and state president, only age 59, an engineer and former vice premier. The amazing thing about this man is how little we know about him. And what we do know is that Deng Xiaoping picked him 10 years ago when he was 49. It's simply amazing. Deng did that. He picked people out and put them in power. He picked them a long time ago. He picked them far ahead, designated them. He saw this man had potential, had promise, and he said he'll be the leader of the next generation. I don't think he would have been picked if Deng hadn't said that. He would have been shuffled aside, but it's hard. Deng is now, an oracle, and if Deng said it, it's hard to go around it. He picked him. Why did he pick him? We don't know, but he had a record of able management in a variety of positions and utter loyalty to the Communist Party of China. That more and more it looks as if this new group are picked not for willingness to take a risk, to take bold decisions. They're not veterans of revolutions and military campaigns. These are proven managers and risk avoiders. These are the people who want to manage. They don't want brilliant people, courageous people like Deng and Zhu Rongji. This man has proven he's loyal. Western observers are a little troubled. They remember his ruthless suppression of dissent in Tibet when he was the party secretary there, largely absentee party secretary. He hated Tibet and stayed away, but he issued the tough edicts. To soften his public image, which is a pretty stern one, we have recently been told that he has an affinity for ballroom dancing, that has softened his image. That he has selflessly served the poor in the poor regions of China, and that's true. He served in 4 poor Western provinces. And that he is showing an affinity for poor and ordinary people rather than prominent leaders, taking an interest in the poor. It's all great propaganda. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But clearly there's concern about his image to soften it. There's something rather chilling about his steely outward demeanor. One little bit of gossip I can add. A close associate of mine, of his, whom I know fairly well, told me that there are aspects of this man we don't know anything about. All the public things are true, but he claims that he knows for sure that this man has gone incognito to parts of China where there are problems. He goes and asks ordinary people, mixes around, wants to find the truth. And if that's true, that gives me hope for him. I think there may be more to this man than we see, but the jury's still out on what sort of a man he is, or what he'll turn out to be. Being smart, if you want to get to the top in China, never reveal your views on anything until you get into power. That's the time you can begin to exercise it. The next is Wu Guangguo. He's the new chairman of the National People's Congress. I don't find him very exciting. He's the right generation. He's a former Shanghai boss. There's still a very strong Shanghai connection with most of these people. He'll be number 2 in protocol terms in both the party and in the state hierarchy. He's a close associate of Jiang Zemin's and is expected to protect his legacy. That's really why he's there. He will not, I can't imagine him trying to give more power and more democracy to the National People's Congress, as we really want to do. He will not be contentious. He will just hold the line. I don't think do much with NPC, but protect the legacy of Jiang Zemin. Then there's Wen Jiabao. Now, the 2 people that I've gotten to know best are Zhu Rongji and Wen Jiabao, because they've both been closely associated with my Environment Council. I've worked with him. He's the chairman of the council. This man is also the right generation, age 60, geologist and vice premier, wide party experience. He worked in Gansu. He's also worked in backcountry for China. He was handpicked by Zhu Rongji. He has been Zhu Rongji's most trusted vice premier. He's done a lot of the tough work in the countryside, rural problems. I found him, and I think most people, to be able, honest, industrious, sympathetic to the environment and rural concerns. He has all of those qualities. The question in my mind, and I just don't know the answer to this, is he has a lot of Zhu Rongji's qualities, but it's unclear to me if he has Zhu's courage, conviction, and vision. Zhu is a remarkable man, and this man is able, dedicated, honest, but I'm not sure he's got the royal jelly to take the really bold decisions that are going to be required. But I'm not condemning him. I just think we just don't know. So what is the outlook for the next 20 years? First, let me say a word about the effect of admission to the World Trade Organization. Adherence to WTO rules will do some good things for China. It was a bold step. It will reduce import tariffs and quota restrictions. It will attract more foreign capital, and there's already a lot going into China. It will stimulate economic growth, and it will introduce some clear, enforceable rules. Indeed, China's foreign trade increased 22% this year alone, just with the news that China was in their WTO. But I would caution, WTO is not a panacea for all of China's problems. First of all, the foregoing improvements, reducing tariffs and quotas, will only happen gradually. The WTO agreement provides for a multi-year phasing in of these changes, so it would take up to 5 years to really kick in, and it varies from sector to sector. And it's partly because of the agreement, and partly because China does not have the institutional capacity to implement all of these reforms quickly. And in some cases, like agriculture, they even have a disincentive to do it. They want to slow it up. WTO accession will put uncomfortable pressure on some sectors, inefficient sectors like agriculture. In the long run, it will be a good thing, but it will be tough for the first decade. It will also help to free the economy of red tape. But here again, the capacity of WTO to solve bureaucratic problems should not be overstated. WTO has not accomplished this in India or Japan, and China's system is even more controlled and opaque than those are. Unlike an IMF program, I know IMF is not popular with a lot of young people, but an IMF program requires that a currency be made convertible, that a government approval process be simplified, and that state-owned banks stop dubious lending program practices. Yet it is precisely those practices that distort competition. On balance, however, WTO accession should stimulate economic growth and the expansion of China's trade and investment. Now, I'd like to turn next to China's the economic forecast about the future. As I've said, the party decided that China should quadruple its GDP by 2020. Can China really do this? Is this doable? On the face of it, it seems yes. All they would have to do is keep growing at 8%. They grew at 8% this year. They've grown 8% quite a few years in the past. Just keep growing at 8%, and they'll reach the target by 2020. And yes, when an agrarian economy, as China's has been stagnant for a long time and is ripe for industrialization, it can sometimes generate high economic growth for a few decades. But to date, no country has been able to sustain that indefinitely. So why did the party select such a difficult target? I believe because that would be the optimum growth rate to absorb all the new entrants into the labor force and take care of the inefficient sectors of the economy and still provide some improvement of the standard of living. In theory, it's not impossible to attain what it seems to me hugely ambitious. In my view, a more plausible but still remarkable growth projection is that of 6.5% growth. That projection has been made by several Western organizations, the World Bank, Lehman Brothers Merchant Bank, a different sort of organization, Harvard School of Government. They all think 6.5% growth over the next 20 years is possible. It's possible if China sticks to its reform program. And even that would be remarkable. That would triple the economy by 2020. And even under that scenario, not the tripling, the growth would be propelled. Why do they think that? It would be propelled by high savings. China has still one of the highest savings rates in the world. Instead of putting their money into consumption, as we all do in North America, it's putting into investment, into growth. Structural change, there's still room for people to move from agriculture to industry and then even to the service sector, where it's happening in the Western world. And economic reforms, there's still room for reform to move more to the market economy. So theoretically it's possible. Now if this theoretically possible attainment, if we triple the economy by 2020, what would be some of the stunning results? By 2010, China would have over 500 million middle-class consumers. It would become the world's largest consumer market. By 2020, 20 years from now, Chinese incomes would be $10,000 per capita. Thus, China would achieve Deng Xiaoping's target of catching up to South Korea's income levels 30 years ahead of schedule. We scoffed when he said he could do it by 2050. It looks like they'll do it by 2020. By 2020, then, China could have 1.5 billion people earning substantial disposable incomes. And one of the targets for this disposable income is a new formula, 20-20-20. 20% of the people owning private cars by 2020. I think that's a disastrous program, but it's excited a lot of people. Thus, this would make China the world's second largest exporter and importer after the United States, with a purchasing power larger than all of Europe combined. Both growth patterns would bring such spectacular results that they may seem unbelievable. But such a rapid change in the world balance of economic power is not unprecedented. It would be similar to what happened to the US economy in the 19th century. Few scattered colonies became a major world power, and what happened to Japan in the 20th century. small island, few island, became a world power. It could happen. It would be, in my view, good for the world economy. It would be, and Canada included, and it would be a rising tide that would lift all boats, the way the U.S. economy and Japanese economy would be. Thus, if we look just at economic factors, it's possible to be very optimistic about China's future prospects. However, this is my last major point, non-economic factors are equally critical to progress. The economic factors alone look good, but you can't just look at them. Before China can contemplate becoming the world's #2 power, it must do several hard things. It must contain the adverse effects of unemployment, the rural-urban shift of labor, which will be massive, the social unrest that will accompany it, through the development of a social safety net and the development of civil society. It must also develop institutional infrastructure to manage profound change in China. It needs the rule of law. It is instituting a lot of laws, but they still don't understand the concept of the rule of law, that it's law that's supreme. It's not just that leaders use laws to control people. Independent courts, they need freedom of information. They still don't understand that concept. Viable commercial banks, effective central bank, transparent budget and tax system, regulatory agencies, and probably a better sharing of power and resources between the central, provincial, and municipal governments. That's a huge menu. It also needs to maintain stable international environment. Especially, it needs to reach a long-term understanding with Taiwan, the United States, and Japan. On that one, however, I must say that's not entirely up to China. There's only so much China can do alone to stabilize that situation in international relations. Much will depend on what the United States chooses to do, whether it chooses to cooperate with China or contain China. And lastly, it needs to find the political will and leadership to complete the transition to a market economy with an effective social safety net. A critical question will be, will Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao have the royal jelly to replace the tough, brilliant, and far-sighted Deng Xiaoping and Zhu Rongji? So what is my conclusion? Despite several serious socio-economic, institutional, and environmental problems, China has now decisively, and I think irrevocably, joined the modern world. Its huge, clever, and industrious population no longer lives in isolation, and it aspires to share our living standards. Over the next 20 years, China has the potential to become the world's #2 economy and a major military and political power. Whether this is attainable depends partly on other countries trying to understand and cooperate with China rather than confront it, and most importantly, on China's new rulers developing the institutions and the leadership skills to maintain internal social and political stability. Thank you. Time to keep talking.
Questions, comments? Sir,
Could you tell me when China will respect copyright, patent, and trademarks? And I mean on a serious level, not just the piracy going around crushing the tapes and stuff.
Well, of course, they are obligated to do that under WTO, and they will certainly be pressed by the Americans. I mean, we all have an interest in that, but it's the Americans who have the clout to press it. There are people in China, the senior leaders understand the importance of doing that, the necessity to do it. They still don't really have the institutional machinery to police that at all levels. There have been a few showcase trials. They go around and round out the CDs, which are sold openly on the main streets of Beijing, and you know, burn them, but they have a long way to go. I don't know the answer. I think it will happen. But I'm not, it'll take, I don't know, probably 5 years, and it will still be isolated cases. But I think the leadership understands the need to do something effectively. Unfortunately, although WTO has very tough rules, it's really very hard to enforce it, because you have to wait until you can prove injury, and then it has to be, a country has to bring a case against them, a tribunal has to be set up. It's a very cumbersome machinery, and you're apt to get much more effective action by a big country like the US saying this is important to us and pushing them than using the formal WTO machinery.
I think one of the, I think one of the most interesting things that's been happening in this area is the growing number of joint venture investments by the major, for example, software development companies in North America and their major counterparts in China, because when you have a vested interest within China, then you have people who will work within China to look after what become not just Microsoft's interests, but their interests as well. But it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. Sir.
Thank you. Forgive me that I wasn't able to hear the whole of your talk, but I noticed in your summary and conclusion, you didn't mention the word oil, but you did mention American expansion and growth in the 19th, and I assume you also mean 20th century. That was fueled to an astonishing extent by oil. Now, China doesn't have very much oil, as I understand it. It's been importing oil since the 1990s. As few people here perhaps know, the whole of the world is unable to increase its oil production anymore except for the Middle East. So the big question is, where is China going to get its oil? South Korea uses more oil per capita than India, for instance. It's catching up with Germany. Where's the oil going to come from? Otherwise, there'll be no growth. In fact, there'll be negative growth.
Yes. The main energy source in China today is coal, not oil. Of course, for some things you do need it. They do have quite large natural gas, and they're working very hard at developing that, the Tarim Basin, etc. So they are relying on two things. They know they have limited oil, and they'll have to import it. They are relying on new technology to enable them to use coal more efficiently and more cleanly, and they're working very hard on that, polygeneration, gas flow and polygeneration. We have a group of experts, world experts working on that. They think there's a lot of potential to convert a lot of this oil, this gas, to be used for many sources of energy, and to use natural gas. On oil, they know they will have to import it. That's why they have to plug into the international system. It's one thing which makes them part of the international system. They realize they cannot grow if they're totally isolated. They have to be part of the system. They don't have to buy it. But they think they have the potential to earn so much foreign exchange they won't have trouble buying oil from others. And they're doing very well. Their trade balance is remarkable. So far, they're able to buy it without any problem. But it's good. It's a point for everywhere in the world, and it affects world growth, not just Chinese growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think our friends in the U.S. are actively working on the problem of open government.
What would be the relationship between the Chinese leadership and corporations who are going to be, particularly American corporations who are going to be essential for this economic growth, since we are willing to let China produce everything for us? Is it not a fear that those corporations will want to have more control than they do now?
Well, there's an amazing affinity between big political leaders and big corporate leaders. They like each other. They're very cozy. The senior corporation leaders from the U.S. get the top level treatment. They get to see the big leaders all the time, and even some of the top Canadians. I mean, one other group I'm with is the Canada-China Business Council, and our chairman until recently has been the chairman of Power Corp. Now, Power Corp is very powerful, very plugged in, very closely related to the to the Prime Minister, etc. And boy, did they get the royal treatment. I mean, you can, commissars from other communist countries, nobody pays any attention. It's the big corporate leaders they want to deal with. And they like head-to-head, top-level dealing with each other. They're very cozy with each other. The biggest problem is not to induce them to come to China and to look, but to stay in China. A number of them, China sounds so marvelous. It's so intriguing, you know, 1.3 billion customers. If you can, whatever your product is, if you can just tap into that market, your fortune's made. But it doesn't work that way. Usually you come in, unfortunately, the problem frequently is you come in, you invest, you transfer technology, the Chinese pick it up and replicate it much more cheaply, and the foreign investor, after 5 years, goes away and hasn't heard very much. So that's why the people who are the most comfortable are the big corporations, because China doesn't want to lose all those big corporations. The little guy they don't care about, but they don't want to frighten away General Motors and Toyota. One of the key drivers in the economy, as they see it, are the big automobile companies. It's a strange anomaly that communist leaders and corporate leaders, I think they have a lot in common.
How does China see the nuclear situation today in North Korea? What are we doing about it behind the scenes? We obviously in the news is the Americans.
Yeah, well, boy, it couldn't be a hotter topic than that one. China China shares with the United States an interest in limiting proliferation of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. They are very worried about North Korea. They always have been. As I mentioned earlier, they came to help North Korea back in 1950, but now they're worried about North Korea. They consider it the single most destabilizing force in East Asia. But their view is the best way to deal with North Korea is not to bully or threaten it, but to negotiate with it. And they worked quite hard on this. Unfortunately, they had a better rapport with Kim Il-sung, the father, than they do with the son. The son, many people think he is certifiably insane. And it's very hard to deal with him. The father was not insane. The father was tough and smart and ambitious, but he wasn't insane. But this guy, you never know what he's going to do next. And there are a lot of, in China, many people believe that many of the generals in North Korea are equally happy with Kim Jong-il. He's an irrational force. We may not like Saddam Hussein, but he's not crazy either. But this guy in North Korea may be. And the Chinese work very hard. They're trying to be responsible. They're trying to keep channels open because they're as worried as anybody about that. Maybe more worried because they live next door.
Did you say the North Korean generals are happy with Kim Il-sung?
No. Some of the North Korean generals, of course, nobody says this out loud. They've indicated they are unhappy with Kim Jong-il. Are unhappy. They are unhappy with Kim Jong-il. They are worried about his irrationality.
The topic of corruption, that's absolutely fascinating. And I'm trying to put it in some kind of context. For example, in the 80s, I think, partly due to the repressiveness of Mao, they were relatively free. I mean, they seemed to be free of corruption. And yet, in the 90s, in the short span of less than 10 years, it was back in as a full flower. And of the challenges that you mentioned, at least 5, if not all 7 of them, it's rife with corruption, because whether it's the uneven distribution of wealth or the inefficiency of the state. So I guess my question is, and I think in earlier times in China it was corrupt as well, but then it was a privilege of class, entitlement. So when it was, as it were, gotten rid of due to Mao, how did it came back so fast? I mean, is this totally endemic? Is this in their genes, or what is this? I mean, we have it too. I mean, and being Chinese, I think I would say this. I mean, the we, you're totally befuddled as to what I'm talking about now.
Well, first of all, I don't think there's anything genetic about corruption.
I think corruption is always related to the mores of society.
it's even a question of definition. One man's corruption isn't necessarily the other man. It depends on the mores of society. I think that in old China, there was a very powerful Confucian ethic in which there was an understanding of relationships and responsibilities, and that permeated throughout society. Whether you were a father or a head of a clan, you had responsibilities, etc. And that was in place for a long time. Then all of a sudden, Mao came along and communism came along, and a whole new morality was introduced. But there was a form of morality. It was all related to communist ideals. And there was a kind of guiding ideology. People understood what was right and wrong in terms of the prevailing ethic, which was the communist ethic. Now, that's gone, and nothing has been put in its place. And people, the only maxim that I heard is from Deng Xiaoping, to get rich is glorious. But that is simply not satisfactory. For young people, well, I shouldn't generalize, but a lot of young people, the main thing is just to get rich, and then everything will fall into place. But as they get older, they find that's less and less satisfying. And I find a spiritual hunger in China. Some people are turning back to Buddhism. Some are searching for Christian churches. I think there's a hunger. I don't think it's genetic. I think every person everywhere tries to find a meaning in life and a way to conduct themselves. And I think there just isn't a framework in China which is satisfying to people now. And that will be a problem for the next generation. Because in the days of Mao, although we didn't like many of the things Mao did, honesty was just unbelievable in China. If you left your hotel room, you left your toothbrush behind, people were going after it to return to you. Now they'll try and, sell you a toothbrush for 20 times the real price. So it's just completely turned around, but that's a temporary phenomenon.
The very idealistic slogan, 向前看, look to the future. Unfortunately, the future is a complete homophone with money. 向前看, look for the money. And it's possible to simultaneously sound like you're being idealistic and you're being very, very
At the end of your talk, you cited a couple of the major unknowns, and one of them was whether the United States would help or hinder China's development. When I was spending time in China recently, I was quite shocked. In fact, I'm not sure I really heard this correctly. A report on CNN that when Bush was in Blair House prior to his inauguration, he was given finally the top security briefing and told that he would face 3 great challenges or threats. 1, world terrorism, Al-Qaeda. 2, the spread of weapons of mass destruction. And 3, China. What is it with the Americans? Are they really afraid of that the world is going to become bipolar again, or do they have bipolar disorder, or what? I don't know.
I hardly know where to start with that question, but first of all, I think America is obsessed with its role as being the leading power, and they have a responsibility now to keep the global system in order. That was a system in various times. Other countries have had that mantle. The British were the top dog for a long time, and Rome, and go back, and of course in Asia, China was for a long time. I think the U.S. is not comfortable with that role of having that responsibility for the whole world. And therefore, they keep looking for threats or reasons which would inhibit them from carrying out that responsibility. And that's the part of the idealistic aspect of America. I mean, America is, unlike China, is very much driven by morality, ethics, religion, etc. So there's an idealistic streak which says we're responsible, we have to ascertain what the problems are and deal with it. There's another side of America which drives in the same direction, which is quite different, and that is there is a very powerful industrial group which has a vital interest in the arms industry. And they have a major stake in always having a threat to America. When the Russians faded, they had to find somebody else, It had to be Saddam Hussein, it had to be somebody else. And if you look around, and if you need a justification for a huge arms industry, constant investment in arms and build-up, you have to find a credible threat. And the only credible threat around The Russians now are deemed to be toothless. The European Union, you know, could be an economic rival but not a military rival. China's the only credible threat. So there's both of these instincts impel people in the U.S. to look for a threat. And China simply is it in terms of economic growth, in terms of size, in terms of past conduct that has disturbed the Americans. But America, one shouldn't generalize. And that's one streak in America, but it is a big democratic society where debate is encouraged and where the pendulum swings. The pendulum swings. Right now, I think we have a right-wing isolationist government, essentially. And we've seen that in America, but it will change again. They will be open to new ideas. And if China and the U.S. can have a dialogue, I think it could be a very effective partnership. It doesn't need to be a rivalry between these two. It could go that way, but it isn't necessarily so.
I think this might not necessarily be an American culture thing. I think anywhere around the world, when a leader just barely squeaks into office, or when the leader knows that it doesn't have necessarily a majority of the population behind him or her, they look for common enemies and common threats. I think that's an endemic way of rallying or trying to rally people behind you.
As China develops politically and economically, how do you think Canadian foreign policy should or will change?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
As China develops politically and economically, as predicted,
Yes.
how do you think Canada's role will change, or how do you think Canada's foreign policy should change in relation to that?
Well, it's a very opportune question. The Foreign Minister of Canada announced today that he wants to enter into a dialogue with the people of Canada about whether we should have foreign policy changes. And I certainly think that is long overdue. I think we have a foreign policy which is no longer relevant to Canada's needs or Canada's position in the world. That needs a lot of thought. We did play a very prominent role immediately after the war. We've been fading ever since. I think we're not credible players either in foreign policy terms, military terms, or economic development terms now. I think we have the potential to play a very useful role in terms of the U.S.-China debate, and dialogue, because we've had a much steadier relationship with China over the years. Of course, we're major partners with the U.S. In all things, but with China we've had a long relationship. You know, we sold them wheat when nobody else did. We've never entered into Cold War polemics. We've had a trading relationship. We've had people flow back and forth. So we are in a position to help that dialogue, but both sides have to be prepared to use us, and we have to be credible players. One reason the Americans don't take us seriously is because we have no armed forces to speak of. And the armed forces are powerful in the U.S. and in China, actually. It's hard to be listened to if you're not a player in the Pacific. That's a strange doctrine for somebody who comes from foreign policy and economic development stream to say military power is important, but it is. Power flows from the barrel of a gun, not hardly an original phrase, but if you don't have some credibility, people don't listen to you. One of the most powerful negotiators in any dealings in the Pacific is the U.S. Navy, and they only listen to people who've got ships. And, and so if we're going to play a role, we have to be prepared to define what that role is going to be, where we're going to concentrate, what region and in what sector, whether it's going to be in economic development, whether it's going to be in military, and we have to put money into it. And then people will listen to us. We have the background, we have the potential, but right now we're not very credible.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Earl to stick around for a couple of minutes, okay? But I'd like to call the formal part to a close here with two items. Number one, if you're interested in where Earl's, where he's coming from, literally, his memoirs are published by the University of Toronto Press called Stubble Jumper in Striped Pants. You'll find out a lot about where he comes from, literally and figuratively there.
The SFU bookstore.
Pardon?
The SFU bookstore.
You can get it in the SFU bookstore.
And it's a bargain.
And a terrific walk.
And to remind you that our next scheduled forum is on Wednesday, February the 26th, where Donald Sear, who's with us here today, will present his forum on the art of global thinking, East and West, conflicting or complementary. And you're welcome to come to that. And the last thing, it is my pleasure. We've run out of commemorative pens to give to Earl because he's been speaking with us and for us for over a decade now. So we decided to shift the mode here. And you have been exercising and working out a lot lately, and I've been told that if this is too large, you can't exchange it for something. Thank you very much.